Good afternoon. I'm Martha Minow, and I'm the Dean of Harvard Law School, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you here to this very special event. We will honor Oren Bar-Gill on his appointment as the William J. Friedman and Alicia Townsend Friedman Professor of Law and Economics, and you can join me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the chair and then a little bit more about our honoree. So, William Friedman was a native of Chicago and a graduate of the University of Chicago before he came to Harvard Law School. He was a member of the Harvard Law Review, and he returned to Chicago and practiced there for 70 years. Okay? He helped to organize the Hilton Hotel Corporation. He also became one of the two investors to buy the Empire State Building. He was active as a philanthropist. He served as vice president and director of the Combined Jewish Appeal. He sat on the board of directors of the Menninger Foundation. His wife, after William passed away, designated that following her death, there would be a gift to Harvard Law School, and that gift is this chair. I want to note two more things about him. Friedman was himself instrumental in designing and effectuating the merger of mass transit lines in Chicago. Anyone been to Chicago, you know there's the elevated train and there's the surface trains. And William Friedman organized the way to connect them. Hold on to that thought, because there's going to be a connection. And the other... Get it? Connection? And the other comment is that from all accounts, he was simply a lovely, lovely human being. Another connection. So we turn now to talk about Oren Bar-Gill, who, let me say, is a loving, wonderful, generous, and beloved person who knows how to connect things and connect them brilliantly. He connects complex systems of thought. He connects law, psychology, economics, theory, practice, and so he's going to be embarrassed, but I'm going to say more stuff about him. He received his bachelor's in economics from Tel Aviv University. He earned a master's in law and economics, an LLB in law, and a PhD in economics. He then received his LLM from Harvard Law School and his SJD. He was an Olin Fellow here, and he received the Olin Prize for Best Paper in Law and Economics. He also was nominated for and selected for the Society of Fellows at Harvard University, where we actually first met, because the Society of Fellows is an extraordinary place designed by a former president of the university for people who actually are better than faculty members. The idea is to find the very best people on the planet and give them time and money to do their own research with no obligations. Oren Bar-Gill was selected for one of those fellowships, and he dazzled everyone, including me. He joined NYU as an assistant professor, and within 3 years was promoted to professor of law and became the co-director of NYU's Center of Law, Economics, and Organization. He also received the Best Paper Award from the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers, and his work on consumer contracts was recognized by the American Law Institute, which awarded him its inaugural Young Scholars Medal. And then one of the happiest days of my life, not just as dean, but as a member of this community, was to convince Oren Bar-Gill to come back to Harvard. And such joy, truly, truly. He currently serves together with Omri Ben-Shahar and Valencia Murata-Wurgler as reporter for the restatement of the law Consumer Contracts. He also is a co-director of the Klemenko Fellows Program. He also has served on the Harvard Law School Faculty Hiring Committee. He is indispensable. But now about his scholarship. Oren has quickly established himself as a leading expert on the law and economics of contracts and contracting. He's exceptionally creative. The work draws on and advances law, economics, and psychology. He's a pioneer in bringing a psychologically realistic perspective to how consumer contracts work, how credit cards work, how we don't understand the ads that come to us and nonetheless sign up for the credit cards, and his work marvelously bridges theory and practice, which means that he's been able to influence public policy. His wide publications across law reviews and journals include publications in the Journal of Legal Studies, Cornell Law Review, University of Chicago, American Economics Journal, and many more. His work is cited widely. He's placed among the topmost cited faculty members in the Social Science Research Network. He's very well known for his book, Seduction by Contract, good title, Law, Economics, and the Psychology in Consumer Markets. And in that book, he explores tensions in a world where consumers are often, let's say, less than rational and short-sighted and not well equipped to manage the seller's complex long-term contracts that, let's be clear, have been carefully crafted to be confusing. Better legal policies to promote mandatory contractual disclosures could help both buyers and sellers. He notes and he argues and he develops. He also, wonderfully, has developed accessible explanations of the complex workings of consumer behavior, of markets, and of contracting. And this level of clarity and his contributions to knowledge have improved the advice not only to consumers but also to consumer advocates and law reformers, notably in the field of cell phone contracts. Richard Posner said, "This is important work. This injects psychological realism into the economic analysis of law." Not bad for the guy who founded the field. Richard Epstein, who calls himself Oren's designated rational choice nemesis, more on that later, he says, and I quote him, he applauds the ambitious effort to account for the role of human error in the full range of consumer transactions. Oren's bold claim that product and service providers, even in competitive markets, are able to manipulate the terms of standard form contracts to their private advantage, if sustainable, creates a prima facie case for governmental regulation of these consumer markets. Richard Epstein says he convinces me there should be regulation. This is unbelievable. And Oren says Richard Epstein promises to be at the center of continuing debate of national importance. Oren's work includes model designs for default contracts that allow consumers to choose contract terms that best match their own preferences. His work covers a range of topics from property rights and misperceptions in consumer markets, and it's remarkably practical while being theoretically precise and rigorous. A student of Oren's recently said that in Oren's class there were discussions of zombie contracts, the kinds of contracts that automatically renew on your credit card, like subscriptions to magazines that you haven't recently renewed. And because of the class discussion, the student said he has now invested in and developed a new tech company that will help detect this as a problem, help identify these contracts on your credit card bill, and negotiate to terminate and refund. Not bad for a day's work. Oren said he was glad that his student was applying his lessons to the real world. And he said, and I quote Oren, "Law school, it's not like theoretical math department. We do want to influence the real world. Sometimes we do it through the courts or discussions and involvement with regulators and legislators. But I think it often happens through engagement with the market and the private sector." Okay, I'm almost done, but first I have to indicate the results of crowdsourcing. Cass Sunstein says, "Oren is as interesting and rigorous and playful as any law professor in behavioral economics and law." And Cass goes on and says, "I can sum up Oren in one word: tremendous." Steve Shappell said, "They like to play tennis together and gossip." I'm not going to go further with Steve Shappell. Lucian Bebchuk says, "When Oren came to Harvard Law School and I became his supervisor, I saw right away that he was extremely smart. That did not take much observing. Next, I learned over time some other qualities: his gracious, kind, and gentle manner, and his seeming to be never under pressure. Last, when I offered him work on some joint research projects, I learned his exceptional effectiveness and remarkable speed. We would meet to discuss revisions, and I would say this could take many, many days, and reorganization and significant work. But generally, Oren would email me the completed revision that night or the next day. I couldn't believe it, but then, as it kept happening, I did. I realized that Oren was, in this respect, as in many others, very special. Gabriella Bloom calls Oren, and I quote, a daunting but wonderful co-author. You run an idea by him, and he sends you a full draft within 24 hours. Sometimes the draft has too many Greek letters and equations in it, but otherwise it is perfect. She also notes, and again I quote, Oren beats his kids in video games, which is highly unusual. He even does Xbox dance and is excellent at it. He and Segal are quite good dancers and put everyone to shame on the dance floor. Overall, Gabby says, Oren is, and I agree, the sweetest, most generous, most dedicated colleague one could ask for. I think we've sufficiently embarrassed you. I hope that you will stay not just only for this lecture, but also for a reception afterwards. And now I am, with great joy, happy to introduce Oren Bar-Gill, the William J. Friedman and Alicia Townsend Friedman Professor of Law and Economics.
Thank you so much, Martha, for this generous introduction. A bit too generous, but I'll take it. Also, thank you, Martha, for your support and friendship, and most importantly, for bringing me back home to Harvard Law School. It is very special for me to be appointed to the Friedman Chair, first for the accomplishments of William Friedman himself, but also is very special for me to inherent to the chair that my teacher and mentor, Lucian Bebchuk, held before me. I can say with confidence that I would not be standing here today if it were not for Lucian Bebchuk. I'm also extremely grateful to my colleagues, teachers, and friends, and of course, the students who came here. Thank you so much for being here. But I have to end, most importantly, by thanking my family. I want to start by thanking my parents, Aaron and Nechama, who came from Israel for this event. Again, I would not be here without their love and support throughout the years. I want to thank my children, Noam and Guy. You are the light of my life. And last but not least, where's my, oh, I forgot my sister because she's sitting over there. Thank you. My sister, Sagit, and my brother, Nir, who is in Israel. And last but not least, my lovely wife, Segal. I don't know where I would be without our partnership and love. So thank you for indulging me in this Oscars type thank you thing. I was told by, on good authority by some very smart people that I am unlikely to actually receive an Academy Award. And also, just yesterday, Lucian told me in confidence that I'm also unlikely to receive a Nobel Prize. So it seems like this is my last chance to publicly thank these very important people. OK, so now to the topic of the talk today. I want to talk about frontiers in consumer law. The problem in consumer law begins with imperfect information and imperfect rationality. And all of this starts with the mere fact, a really important and basic fact, that consumer contracts are exactly the type of contracts that we never read. Why don't we read them? Because they're really long. And this is not just figuratively, they're literally long. So this handsome gentleman over here is my friend and colleague, Omri Ben Shahar, who actually took the time to print out and glue together the iTunes terms and conditions contract and hang it from the ceiling of the University of Chicago Law Library. So you see, this is really a lot of fine print terms. And so it, of course, not surprising that we decide not to read it. It doesn't make sense to read it. In fact, it's probably irrational to read it. Now, we don't read it because it's very long. We also don't read it because even if we read it, we probably would not understand it. And the fact that you would not understand if you read is a good reason not to read in the first place. Now, why wouldn't we understand it? First, because of all this legal jargon in the fine print, that most lawyers don't understand, let alone lay people. Beyond that, even looking outside of the fine print, looking at the business terms of contracts, like price, terms that we are supposed to, in fact, notice and look at and search for when we're comparing products, even with respect to these types of non-fine print terms, it will be very difficult for us to understand them and take them into account in a rational way in our decision-making as consumers. The reason for that is that in many of these consumer markets, many of these consumer contracts, the price terms are multidimensional and complex to a level that is very difficult to penetrate and understand. These problems of imperfect information and imperfect rationality lead to bad outcomes in consumer markets. So here is a caricature of what happens when frequent flyer award miles don't really turn out to be what you expected them to be. Now, obviously, this is a caricature, but it captures something really important and real in consumer markets. And this is the reality where sellers and service providers promise you a lot in their advertisements, but then try to undermine and qualify and limit these promises in the fine print. And this is not limited to award flights. Just recently in the news and all abuzz social media, we've seen what United has done and how it has tried to justify it through their fine print. Another type of kind of bad outcomes, another example comes from from mortgage markets. Okay, another really important type of consumer contract. And we know that when consumers enter into these mortgages, sign up for these loans without really understanding what they say, what are the implications in terms of costs over time, the results can be very painful and very costly. And so we have these problems in consumer markets. And the question for us as lawyers in law school is, what should we do about them? What can we do about them? What are the legal and regulatory tools at our disposal to try to protect consumers and prevent these bad outcomes from taking place? Now, of course, I can't go over all of the tools available in our legal arsenal today, but I want to focus briefly on 4 categories of regulatory techniques. Talk about disclosure mandates, about default rules, about price caps, and about contract law doctrine itself. Let me start with disclosure. And the first thing I want to emphasize is that when we're talking about disclosure, at least now when we're talking about disclosure, we're not talking about this type of disclosure. I call this the kind of old disclosure. When the law forces sellers to give you all the terms of the contract in advance, that is a type of mandatory disclosure. And there are many other examples where the law requires very extensive, lengthy disclosure of terms. Of course, I'm axing this out because it's clear to everybody that this is completely useless. It's useless for the reason that we mentioned. Nobody reads it. So when I'm talking about disclosure mandates, and disclosure mandates that can actually help consumers, I'm talking about these new types of disclosures. Sometimes they're called smart disclosures because stupid disclosures don't make much sense. And when we're talking about these new disclosures, we're referring to these short, summary disclosures, okay, that consumers can quickly read and quickly understand. One example of these types of disclosures is the Schumer box for credit cards. Okay? Another type of new disclosure would be a GMO warning. Again, these are the type of disclosures. As you can see, they're very different from the very long fine print terms of the iTunes contract. These are things that consumers can readily observe, see, understand, and act upon. And so when we're talking about these new disclosures, we're talking about disclosures that are effective, that can actually influence behavior, which is not true with the old disclosures that nobody reads. Those can't influence behavior. But once we are in the realm of disclosures that can actually influence consumer behavior, it's really important that we make sure to influence consumer behavior in the right direction. Okay? And there is really important challenges in the design of these disclosures. Now, this was not a problem with the old disclosures. They couldn't influence consumer behavior, and that's why we didn't care about what they said. Okay? For these new disclosures, we do care. Okay? And therefore, it's really important to design them in a very careful way. And if we don't design them in a careful way, some bad things can happen. Okay, so let me give you an example, and this is an example from recent work that I've done with Cass Sunstein and David Shkadi. And what we did in this paper is try to understand, identify, and measure the problem of false inferences from disclosure mandates. To understand this problem, let me start with kind of step number 1 and suggest to you that the effect that disclosure mandates have on consumer behavior depends on the motives that consumers attribute to the regulators that have decided on this new type of disclosure. Okay? So in particular, if we're thinking about say, GMO disclosures. It really matters. What is the reason in consumers' mind why the regulator have decided to mandate a GMO-type warning? For example, if consumers think that the reason why a regulator mandated this type of warning is because the regulator received new research suggesting that GMO foods are hazardous to our health or to the environment, then consumers are going to increase their beliefs about the risks associated with these products. So this is what you see here. Okay? So this is the kind of the lighter bars on the left. Okay? When we move from no disclosure to disclosure and consumers think that the decision was based on research, then their posterior beliefs about the risks associated with the product goes up. On the other hand, if consumers believe that the regulator in deciding on this disclosure mandate was motivated by politics, by interest group pressure, then we have a very different effect on consumers' risk attitudes or risk beliefs. Okay, and so you see here on the politics, the darker bars, actually the perceived risk goes down when the regulator chooses disclosure over non-disclosure, or chooses to mandate disclosure. And so this was kind of step number one in the analysis, to show that consumers' beliefs about the motives of regulators has an important effect on what inferences consumers draw from the regulator's decision to mandate disclosure. And now to the second step, and this is the false inference step. The problem is that many consumers hold false beliefs about the motives of regulators. They don't know why a regulator decided to mandate GMO disclosure. Indeed, in the GMO context, the problem was that many consumers thought that the reason for the disclosure mandate was research, when in fact it was not. Okay? And this causes a problem of false inference. Indeed, it causes consumers to overestimate the risk associated with GMO foods, which will lead consumers to buy less of these GMO foods, which is then harmful to consumers and interferes with the efficiency of the market. Let me briefly mention just one other potential motive, in fact, not a potential, a real motive for this type of disclosure. Okay, so indeed, what happened when the regulators were considering the GMO disclosures, many of them thought that the reason or the justification for this disclosure was a right to know. They thought that consumers have a right to know what they're eating, regardless of any risks or hazards associated with this food, okay, with GMO foods. Now, if you're a rational consumer and you believe that this is the motive, a right to know, then you shouldn't change your perceived risk of the product. Okay? But what you see here, and these are the kind of the light, it's not very well, kind of eligible bars, you see that here also there is an increase when consumers think that the motive is right to know. Now, it could be that these consumers are imperfectly rational. It could be that they're conflating a right to know with actually new research of harm from GMOs. But for whatever reason, this exacerbates the false inference problem and interferes with the efficiency of markets. Again, I'm not saying that disclosure mandates are bad. I'm a believer in disclosure mandates when they are well designed. But this suggests that we should be very careful in our choices whether to disclose or not to disclose. Still on disclosure mandates, there is another kind of talking about these frontiers of consumer law and disclosure regulation. What I've said so far has been focusing on disclosure mandates that are designed to facilitate consumers' deliberative thought process using what psychologists call System 2 processing. Okay? So the idea here is we're providing consumers with information. They're incorporating this information into their deliberative decision-making process and therefore making better decisions, hopefully. But there is another type of disclosure. There's a type of disclosure that rather than invoking deliberative System 2 processes actually targets the intuitive, the emotional or affective System 1 processes in our brain. Okay, and so a prime example here are these graphic disclosures, these cigarette warnings. They're not designed to provide you information in kind of a rational, deliberative way. They're provided to elicit emotional responses of fear and disgust. They're also very effective in influencing behavior, but through a very different channel. And so when we're taking together kind of both of these types of disclosures, the smart System 2 disclosures and also the System 1 disclosures, we see that disclosure can be very effective in influencing behavior. And this is a good thing, I would argue. But it's also something that requires caution and deliberate design by regulators and policymakers. When we were talking about the old-fashioned disclosure, people said, and this was often a political consensus, why not just add a disclosure mandate. Okay? The industry was happy with this because it really didn't do anything. And legislators and lawmakers thought, well, at least we're doing something in response to a problem. And the general idea was that we can actually feel like we did something, but without really doing something. And disclosure was always presented as this kind of soft type of intervention, non-paternalistic type of intervention in markets. With respect to new disclosure, this is no longer true. We've seen that these new disclosures, both the summary disclosures, GMO disclosures, the kind of System 1 disclosures, they are very powerful in affecting market outcomes. And so we can no longer say, well, this is just disclosure. It's not paternalistic. There's a real question of paternalism. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means we should be careful in doing it. Let me move quickly from disclosure to the second regulatory tool that I mentioned, and that is default rules. Default rules have been used by policymakers increasingly. And in many cases, these default rules are very powerful. Okay, so maybe the now classic example from this Johnson and Goldstein study is the use of default rules in the organ donations context. So what you see here is the percentage of organ donors in a country's population. Okay, and what you see among these different European countries, that in some countries, the blue countries, almost everyone is an organ donor. And on the other hand, in the orange countries, very few people are organ donors. Now, it turns out that the reason for the difference between these blue and orange countries is just the default rule that was chosen. Okay, so in the orange countries, when you go to get a driver's license in the DMV, you fill this form. And one of the questions on the form is, if you want to be an organ donor, check the box here. In the blue countries, you again go to the DMV and you fill a form. But then the question is, if you do not want to be an organ donor, check the box here. And it turns out that those two words, this switch of default, has a huge effect. Okay, it's basically almost as strong as a mandatory rule. And of course, the impact of this type of policy in terms of lives saved from the more organs that we have is super important. Okay, and so this is an example of a default rule that is very powerful, or we can also say very sticky, meaning that only a few people choose to opt out of the default. But defaults are not always sticky. And so this is another example taking us back to the world of consumer contracts. When we're talking about the bank contracts that we have, say when we open a checking account, okay, in the US, the traditional rule was a rule that when you sign up for a checking account, you automatically get what is called overdraft protection. And this means that if you use your debit card, you charge your debit card, try to purchase something, and you overdraw your account, the bank is going to kind of honor and allow this purchase, but of course tag on an overdraft fee. Okay, so this was overdraft protection, and this was the default for many years. Recently, the law in the US has changed. The default has moved from the default of yes protection to a default of no protection, and now consumers need to deliberately opt into overdraft protection. Now, this default, however, was much less sticky, turns out, than the organ donations default. And we see that a very large number of consumers opted out. And the question is why? Why is one default so sticky and another is not so sticky? And so we have many stories and potential explanations. One explanation is that the banks, they invested a lot of money and effort in order to make sure that consumers opt into overdraft protection because they make a lot of money out of overdraft fees. Okay, so that is one explanation. There's probably a lot of truth to it. But it's also truth to that we don't really have a good theory of default rules. And so in a recent paper with Oren Bar-Gill, we started to develop such a theory. And this theory is based on the assumption that consumers initially are often uninformed about important aspects of the decision. Okay? So in particular, we assume that there are two types of consumers. Some consumers really don't need and don't want overdraft protection. Other consumers do want and need overdraft protection. But initially, consumers don't know if they are part of the first group or part of the second group. They might not know what exactly is the cost of overdraft protection. How are these fees calculated? How high they are? They might also not know what is the likelihood that they would need to overdraw their checking account. How often will this happen? Will they have another method of payment available or not? So all this information is information that many consumers often do not have initially. But they can get this information. Okay? They can invest time and effort, sometimes money, to become informed. And one of the other kind of elements of this analysis is that these costs of information, these information costs, are heterogeneous. For some consumers, they can get informed very quickly with a very low cost or low investment. For other consumers, it's very difficult and costly to become informed. Okay? And so what happens as an outcome of this analysis, one of the results is that you will see some consumers, okay, those consumers usually with lower information costs, these consumers will become informed. And if they learn that they are, in fact, part of the group that actually benefits from overdraft protection, they will opt out of this new default and get the protection that they need. And this theory also tells us, or allows us to predict, what type of defaults and what types of markets will be more sticky and which defaults will be less sticky, and actually kind of slippery. And this all depends on the distribution of information costs. If many consumers have low information costs, defaults are going to be more slippery. If more consumers have higher information costs, then defaults are going to be stickier. This type of framework also allows us to provide guidance to policymakers about how to choose the optimal default. Is the optimal default yes overdraft protection, or is the optimal default no overdraft protection? And again, as we discuss in this paper, this choice, or the design of the optimal default, depends both on the distribution of types, the different types of consumers, and the distribution of information costs among the consumers. The third type of regulatory tool that I wanted to discuss with you is price caps. Okay, and this is based on kind of an article that I written in the Journal of Legal Studies. And this is an article that looks at the use of price caps, and specifically the use of price caps in markets with multidimensional pricing. And again, this is a very large subset of all consumer markets and consumer contracts. It's just kind of a partial list of markets: credit cards, mortgages, cell phones, air travel, hospitality. In all these markets, as you know, price is multidimensional. So this is not like buying a carton of milk in the supermarket when there's just one price. In all these examples, price is multidimensional with different rates and penalties and fees and other prices associated with it. And in many of these markets, lawmakers, these could be regulators and legislators and even courts, they might decide that one price is too high, might actually be too high, and they will then intervene to cap this price, kind of to push it down. And this has happened again in the credit cards market, the mortgage market, in the cell phone market, and so forth. This is oftentimes we see these types of interventions through price caps by regulators. The problem, however, is that when we're talking about markets with multidimensional pricing, the fact that you push one price down is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of the story. So just imagine that you have only two prices in a market. Okay, so assume, if you're thinking about credit cards, that you have one price, which is an annual fee, and another price, which is a currency conversion fee. Okay, the annual fee is down. The currency conversion is very high. Okay, and the regulator steps in and pushes, via price cap, pushes the currency conversion fee down. What would you expect banks to do? They would probably just increase the annual fee. And if that is what happens, then the purpose of this regulation, of this cap, which is to reduce the overall price and cost that consumers pay, might be frustrated. Okay? So this is a reason for concern, or at least caution, about price caps. But I want to suggest that even with, I forgot to tell you about my whack-the-mole illustration, right? So the idea here is, this is like, a whack-the-mole game. You push one, price down, the other one pops up. And because of this reason, as I suggested, there might be kind of some caution about the use of price caps. But I want to actually argue that even with this whack-a-mole problem, in many cases, it is actually beneficial. Price caps can actually do good and help consumers. And the reason for this is the following. You need to imagine and understand why the pre-regulation pricing scheme looked the way that it did. Why were annual fees low and currency conversion fees high? The reason was that annual fees are very salient to consumers. Okay? And so competition focuses on this dimension and pushes this price down. Currency conversion fees, on the other hand, they're non-salient. They're basically invisible to consumers, and therefore sellers can raise them up. Okay? Now, what happens when we have a regulation that pushes the currency conversion fees down and the annual fees then go up? What happens is that now consumers have a much better sense of what the true cost of this product is to them. Before the regulation, they were focusing on annual fees, which were very low. They were ignoring the currency conversion fees. And they thought that the overall product or service is very cheap. And they mistakenly demanded too much, bought too much of this product or service. Now that the currency conversion fees went down and annual fees went up, annual fees are salient to consumers. They now have a better sense of the true cost of the product. Okay? And so even though we don't have an overall reduction in the price that consumers pay, consumers are now able to make more informed, more rational decisions. The final kind of regulatory or legal tool that I want to discuss is contract law doctrine itself. And this discussion will be kind of based on our attempts in the draft restatement of consumer contract law that Dean Minow mentioned, our attempt to kind of nudge and push the doctrine of contract law in a slightly more pro-consumer direction. And the way we try to do this is by adjusting or restating two major doctrines, or two important doctrines in consumer contract law. And this is the doctrine of unconscionability and the doctrine of deception. So let me start with unconscionability. As many of you know, contract law uses unconscionability doctrine in order to strike down, or it gives courts the power to strike down bad terms in contracts. Unconscionability doctrine has two prongs under US contract law. It has a substantive prong, which looks at how unfair or one-sided the term is. But it also has a procedural prong. And this procedural prong is kind of traditionally defined through these formulas of the absence of meaningful choice or unfair surprise. The problem has been, however, that courts are struggling to understand and apply in a consistent way these formulas of meaningful choice and unfair surprise. And so our suggestion in the draft restatement is to use this notion of salience taken from psychology and behavioral economics to provide some more content and some more kind of logical and consistent guidance to the operation of procedural unconscionability. The idea here is that if a term is salient to consumers, namely it affects the contracting decisions of many consumers, then we don't need courts to police it because market forces are going to do a pretty good job on their own. On the other hand, if we have a term that is non-salient to consumers, namely invisible to consumers, and that's probably most of the fine print, okay, then we cannot rely on market forces, and this is exactly when we need courts to intervene. Okay, and so the idea here is to understand or reconceptualize procedural unconscionability through this notion of salience. The second doctrine that I want to mention is the doctrine of deception. And in fact, this is kind of deceptive because there is no doctrine of deception, per se, in consumer contract law. So contract law has these doctrines of fraud and misrepresentation. But the problem with these doctrines is that they're relatively narrow. It's very hard for consumers to effectively invoke them. And so what we are trying to do in this restatement is to broaden these doctrines of fraud and misrepresentation and replace them with something more flexible, something more powerful, like this notion of deception. And in doing so, we borrow from the parallel field of consumer law, the jurisprudence developed by the Federal Trade Commission as it applies Section 5 of the FTC Act, the section that prohibits unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And by doing so, we're hoping to give courts more power, even when they're applying contract law, in order to protect consumers from deceptive practices. And again, this goes back most prominently to that one of the initial examples that I started with, the very common situation where sellers promise you one thing in an advertisement and then try to undermine and qualify in the fine print. So let me briefly conclude. The kind of beginning of all this discussion is the existence of a market failure in many consumer markets, or at least for many consumers in consumer markets. And this is a market failure that begins with the problems of imperfect information and imperfect rationality. And then we need to ask ourselves, what can the law do about this? I've discussed 4 possible legal tools that we use: disclosure mandates, default rules, price caps, and contract law doctrine. I think that all of these tools are valuable, they're promising, they all can be used to protect consumers. But as we've seen, with respect to all of these tools, we need to be very careful in how we think about them, how we design them, when we choose to invoke them. Because if we don't, we might end up doing more harm than good. Thank you very much. Happily.
That was completely marvelous. I have a 2-part question. Do you think that the salience insight is altered if people know that they're affected by what's salient? And if also the sellers know, will that produce a new kind of whack-a-mole? And then the larger question that grows from that is, do you think that there are ways that the kind of empirical research that you have done so much to advance can be mandated in the law, that there should be a consumer impact test or rational basis analysis under administrative law should require some surveying of this kind of research?
Right. So thank you. So the question of salience and kind of how sellers will respond to this type of doctrine, I think is a really important question. Before I kind of give an example of how important it is, I want to emphasize, though, that in many situations, in many consumer contracts, we're talking about very lengthy fine print terms, which are non-salient, and it's impossible to make them salient. There are many examples in the law, including the Uniform Commercial Code, where sellers are offered these safe harbors. If you make something conspicuous, if you use very kind of large fonts, okay, or bold letters, then you are going to be protected from liability. And what we suggest in this restatement project is that this is all for naught, because it just gives sellers a way out, okay, a protection against liability, but without really informing consumers. Because it doesn't matter how big the font is going to be, whether it's going to be kind of all caps or in bold, consumers are not going to read it. Now, so having said that, there could be other situations where sellers are, in fact, induced by this salience-type methodology to actually make things salient. Okay? And we think that actually that could be a good thing. Right? And so the idea is, if sellers have a term that seems on its face one-sided or unfair, but it's really important for the seller's business, maybe it will allow the sellers to charge a lower price for consumers, and they want to make sure that this term is, in fact, enforced, then they can do that by making the term salient. Now, again, what we say is that you can't just make it salient by using a certain type of font and making it all caps. What we show, and this is the test, and this goes back to your kind of larger question, but on the kind of private seller side, is that you actually need to prove to a court through a type of survey methodology that, in fact, many consumers were affected by this term. They were aware of it, and it influenced their decisions. And these are things that courts actually do. It's not something that is a very kind of crazy type of suggestion. So in trademark law, for example, courts use these surveys all the time to figure out what is misleading or not misleading. Courts can use this, and sellers can provide this type of evidence as well. Now, going to the other part of Dean Minna's question, when we're talking about regulators themselves, should we require this type of analysis as part of, say, cost-benefit analysis or another type of administrative law requirements? I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure. You would know better than I how we should do that as a matter of law or doctrine. But this is definitely something that we see regulators doing much more of. Okay, so if we're thinking about regulators like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the Federal Trade Commission, they have groups of economists, behavioral economists, and they engage in these surveys and these studies, and they're doing this more and more to figure out what works, what does not work, what actually affects consumers' behavior, and what does not. And I think this is a wonderful and exciting development. Yes?
Thanks, Oren. So normally I'm a strong believer in regulation, but one thing that I'm puzzled about, and that goes back to your startup-inspired student, why or what is the role of the private market here on the part of on the consumer side? So in offering these services of comparison, at least in the cell phone business, there used to be these companies that you would tell them how you are most likely to use your cell phone, and they would tell you what the best plan is for your purposes. Or people who would do the hard work for you and tell you, among these carriers, note these and these variations. So they're going to be a problem when it's industry-wide. For instance, the United story, when all the airlines have the same kind of or similar policies. But to the extent you can invite or encourage variations through the private market and people making marketing recommendations, why does that not operate or not operate as well?
It does operate. And so as I've said in other places, and as kind of Martha mentioned in her comments, I do believe that the market in many cases can do a lot in order to alleviate these problems. And so we think that consumers can learn. We think that sellers often advertise in a way to try to correct consumer mistakes. I think the example that you gave is an important and useful one in the fact that we can have, say, intermediaries that try to give advice to consumers on which credit card they should choose or which cell phone they should choose. But it's also important to recognize the limits of these markets. And here is one example of the limit. Okay, so when you have, say, these intermediaries that are supposed to give you advice on which cell phone plan to choose, it is very easy for them to get a catalog just off the internet of all the different plans that are offered by the different providers. What is more difficult for them is to get information about how you individually are going to use your cell phone. How much data do you need from month to month? How many text messages are you sending? Do you use it for voice even? I know some people still do that. Okay? And so the use patterns that individuals actually have, and this changes from one to the other, is information that usually my current cell phone company, whom I've been with for, say, 3-5 years, they have all the information about my use patterns, but the intermediary or competitors usually do not. And so we need, one suggestion would be, we need regulation to force this kind of sharing of use information to allow the market and intermediaries to provide better advice. Now, there might be some purely technological solutions even without regulation in this space. So I could imagine that we now have smartphones with apps that can actually monitor our usage and just on their own collect this usage information and then connect with the intermediaries and find the right plans for us. So I think that all of these kind of smart devices will kind of help consumers and empower consumers. And again, it's kind of an arms race between the technology that the sellers use and the technology that is available to consumers.
I have a tiny question. I'm dying to know the difference between the Danes and the Dutch. Do you remember that slide where 4% of the Danes donate their organs and 25% of the Dutch?
Yes, I can tell you.
That's for later.
It was.
That's later. I don't really care about that. But so I have a question about the empirical work. Do any of the studies simultaneously, I don't know what the right words are, interactive studies, really getting at the problem of information overload? So you're studying a consumer confronting one choice, whereas we're inundated. I have my cell phone plan, my natural gas company, my streaming service.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's anything in the empirical work that suggests that at some point there are too many choices so that everything loses its salience because there's some tipping point of overload.
Yes. So first of all, that's great. And this kind of accumulation problem is kind of well known and well documented. There is a distinction, though, about how the accumulation problem works when we're talking about fine print contracts and when we're talking about these new types of disclosures. So it's absolutely right. Let's say if there was only one fine print contract, it was only iTunes. That's the only thing over my lifetime that I ever need to read. I might read it. But since we need to read tens of these every week, okay, then we won't read them. Okay, and this is very powerful and important and true. The question becomes, when we move from these types of disclosures to then new smart disclosures, like a GMO warning, okay, or even a Schumer box, whether the accumulation problem works or how it works. And I don't know of good evidence to this effect, but my intuition is that the accumulation problem is not going to be as severe in those contexts. For the same reason that when we go shopping, we always look at the price tag, and we don't think that there's an accumulation problem if I'm buying shoes and then buying tomatoes. I'm going to look at the price in both of these cases, and I think we have some kind of attention span for each purchase. So as long as we're kind of within the kind of per purchase attention span, I think that the accumulation problem is not going to create a lot of issues. But it really depends on the fact that these smart disclosures are really sufficiently kind of concise and short, like a GMO disclosure, like a price, a one-dimensional price, that consumers can really digest effectively.
Hello, Professor. Considering the current complete lack of consumer literacy when it comes to contracts and the fact that literally no one reads them, do you think that even with smart disclosures, it will be possible to create enough knowledge about at least material terms that at least a conformed minority will be created? And if so, what kind of mandates do you think will be required to reach that level of literacy?
And so, first of all, it needs to be just kind of a quick word on informed minority. There is this theory in the analysis of consumer market that suggests that even if most people don't read, but just a kind of small informed minority read, then this informed minority would be able to kind of move the market and protect all of the other consumers who don't read. So this is a really nice theory, but it assumes that there is some kind of informed minority. So just 1 or 2 out of a million, that's not going to be good enough. Sellers are just going to ignore them. And that's the current situation that we have with respect to fine print. Okay, so the informed minority, to the extent that such exists, is just too small. Now, can we make it larger? Perhaps. But again, as you suggested, only with respect to a certain subset of terms. I don't imagine any way in which we can make a sufficiently large number of consumers aware of all of the terms and conditions in the iTunes contract. It's just impossible, and I don't know how it could happen. There are important kind of core terms that consumers need to know. And we can, through regulation, through smart disclosure rather than stupid disclosure, make sure that these terms are, the consumers are aware of these terms. And again, we need to be very careful and empirically test the disclosures that we have in mind to make sure that consumers are aware of the terms that's important for them to be aware of. This still does not solve the problem that there are many other terms consumers will never be aware of. And here we do need the law, for example, through unconscionability doctrine, to make sure that these terms don't go too far to the pro-seller side.
Hi, I have a question about the normative desirability of having people understand everything that is going to affect their decisions. I'm thinking about a case of a proposed disclosure that was not implemented because the context was people taking out mortgages, and the loans that they were being offered, the interest rate was a function of how much the loan was, but it was also the financial advisor was getting a cut of it. And the proposal was to disaggregate this so you could see how much was going to the advisor and how much the loan was. And when they tried different disclosures, what they had found, if I recall correctly, is that people were choosing worse loans when they knew how much was going to the advisor because they were so offended by the idea of paying that fee that they avoided even better loans because of the fee. And so my question for you is, if disclosure accomplishes that, if it helps people see how much money is going to the advisor as opposed to the loan, is that a success of disclosure, or is that a problem if what that does is it allows people to act on their aversion to something that maybe they shouldn't be averse to?
OK, so there are kind of several kind of levels of answer to this question. It's a great question. So the first part of the question is, well, if consumers really are informed by this disclosure, and now they make a decision, and for some reason we don't like that decision, we think it's a bad decision, we need to ask ourselves, why don't we like it? Okay, so I've been, either for good or for bad, indoctrinated within this world of economics where we kind of take people's preferences for granted, and we kind of respect them. Okay, and so if we think that people actually, these consumers knew what they were getting into, with the help of this disclosure, they understood what really is going on in this transaction, and therefore they chose loan A versus loan B, then maybe we should respect that choice. So that is one kind of level of answer. The other level of answer is perhaps more general, and it goes to kind of the care that we need to take in designing disclosure mandates. So let's say we have good reason not to like the decision that these consumers are now making. Okay, this means that the disclosure that we now put in place is not doing what we wanted it to do. As we said, that if we have these disclosures that are in fact effective, they are influencing behavior, and now we see through this type of research that they're pushing behavior in the wrong direction, this means that we did not design the disclosure in the way that it should have been designed. And so we need to be very careful. On the one hand, we now have a more powerful tool. We have smart disclosure rather than stupid disclosure. But when we have a more powerful tool, we need to take care to use it and design it appropriately.
Thank you. I have a question about, this is on. Oh, there we go. The usefulness of contract law as a legal solution, it seems like that has to be, unconscionability doctrine, for example, has to be premised on the real threat of a lawsuit, even if it doesn't happen. Like, companies are only going to make their contracts comply if they think there's a threat of suit. And given mandated arbitration clauses or collective action problems, I'm wondering how contract law is effective.
It's a great question. So one of the main features of consumer contracts and many claims that consumers bring against businesses is these are often small claims. Okay? So in many of these situations, if you're thinking about Citibank or United or Comcast, they can change their behavior and their practices and their contracts in a way that is going to harm consumers, but harm them just by a little bit, maybe $30 worth of harm, $100 worth of harm. Now, consumers are unlikely to bring suit individually, even in small claims court, for $30. Okay? But these $30 or $100 are multiplied by perhaps 10 million consumers who are suffering each this small claim, right, this small harm. So our standard solution to these types of problems is aggregation, is class actions. But indeed, as you suggested, sellers are now fighting against these class actions. They're putting in their contracts these class barring arbitration clauses. And the Supreme Court has blessed this practice. Now, given the situation, there are some kind of innovative lawyers that are trying to find ways to aggregate within arbitration. They're just kind of collecting a bunch of different claims, many different claims, just bringing them one after the other in a way that is not as efficient as a class action, but can do some good. We have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, under the authority of the Dodd-Frank Act, has conducted studies in a rulemaking process suggesting ways kind of to limit the use of these pre-dispute arbitration clauses. The makeup of the Supreme Court might one day change. But given all of these, even with all these kind of minor, ways around the problem, I completely acknowledge that using kind of private actions to protect consumers is really limited currently. And so in many of these situations, we really need to rely on public enforcement of the law. And trying to design these types of regulatory interventions through public enforcement in as best a way as we can.
Ask a question?
Great, thank you. So that last question was about what happens sort of on the back end when you actually have a dispute at the end and whether there's any way you could have gotten out of it at the beginning. And I'm wondering about things that might be designed at the front end. So by the time you see the iTunes contract, you've already bought the iPhone. And so it sort of suggests that one of the reasons why people agree to these contracts is that by the time they see them, they've already made crucial decisions and they don't have any choice. And this also applies to all the contracts where suddenly you find they're unilaterally renegotiated and there's been an update and then you have to agree to the next thing. So I guess I'm wondering whether any of these solutions apply to the timing of when consumers see contracts relative to when they're making the purchases that the contracts are going to actually apply to, because often you don't see them until it's too late.
Right. So again, this is a great question. Now, first let me say that with many parts of these terms and contracts, it doesn't matter when we see them, before we buy or after we buy, or first modification or second modification. We're not going to read them anyway, so none of this matters. Now, I'm still mentioning this because there's a huge debate, okay, both in the courts and in kind of policy circles about these kind of pay now, term later contracts. Okay, where you pay now and get the terms in the box, or over email or whatever later. And people are really mad about this. And there were so many fights when we were drafting the section of the restatement about these pay now, terms later issues. And I understand where people are coming from, but it's all like second or third order importance because it doesn't really matter. Now, there are certain terms that consumers do pay attention to. And for these terms, timing really matters. Okay? And so what we say there, and this is the difference between terms that are provided in advance and then terms that are provided later through modification, there the question of lock-in is key. Okay? And so if we think that consumers are locked in, if exit is difficult, then we should be much more harshly policing what sellers can do. And so we think that the ability to switch to exit is a huge type of consumer protection, a technique that I did not mention but is really important. And we need to guarantee that exit is easy, and if it is not easy, extra scrutiny of the terms.
There's one more thing we need to do. This is really magnificent, and you have connected both the surface and the elevated, the disciplines, the theory, and the practice, and we're going to unveil a chair, and I'm going to invite you and your family to come up and have a photo, and everyone to come and have a reception. Please join me in thanking Oren.
standing here.